All right, welcome to edition of Ranking the Albums. And today we are doing none other than the bad boys from LA, Motley Crue. And to help me go through this debauchery, none other than Mr. David Hens. Welcome.
Thanks again for having me. This was definitely, I surprised myself on a few of these rankings. So,
Yeah, I mean, some of the ones I had too were definitely, surprising. Like you said, you expect certain albums to land in certain spots, but the
mhm.
ones for me, it was kind of, especially near the, like where they're higher up. That's what was kind of surprising. But there wasn't no too much of a surprise on the lower ones for me.
hmm Yeah, I mean, some of the albums I used to like when I was younger, I don't like as much anymore. I like some of the other ones. So,
Yeah, I mean, definitely got a great catalog. Every album has a good handful of songs that are good songs, really good songs. Even the ones that people might not like as much. The one thing that Nikki Sixx has always done, he knows how to write a song, that's for sure. And with Mick doing the riffs, and as long as you got Tommy Lee on the drums, there's no mistaking Vince's voice, obviously, except for the one album that he doesn't play on.
mhm.
So, all right, so we're going to begin with none other. We're going to go in chronological order, none other than Too Fast for Love. And that starts off released on November 10th of 1981, originally issued on Leather Records, and was reissued by Elektra in 82 once they got signed to the major label there. Yeah, album Too Fast for Love. Uh, at this point, it's showing platinum as certification, ended up being charting as high as number 77.
Yeah, I mean, I like this album a lot. It's got definitely got the raw production sound. They just sound like they were a band trying to show the world who they were at that point. I mean, Live Wire is great. Piece of Your Action is great. Take Me to the Top. It's just the pace of the album. I mean, if you listen to it, it seems like it goes by fast because there's really no filler on it.
Yeah, it definitely has that, like you said, it's only got 10 songs on it, so obviously it kicks off with appropriately with Live Wire. That's the one song that the band has always played in concert live on
Yeah.
every tour pretty much. Probably still to me it remains in my top three Crew songs of all time, which
Mhm.
that's another show for another day. But
Yeah.
but yeah, I would say on this one, a couple of the deep tracks I really enjoy are like On with the Show. Definitely a good way to end the album. That one was actually written by the lyrics were written by Vince and Nikki. Great album, great song though. That's a great way to close out the album. Obviously, Piece of Your Action was another one that got a lot of airplay. They still play that one live here and there. What's your take on some of the songs that you thought stood out for you, or some of the underdogs?
Yeah, I like the title track obviously, and Merry Go Round is good. They just I mean, and I think that this is one of the albums where Vince's voice really sounded the best it ever has. I mean, he still, he hadn't really lost anything at that point. I mean, they just I mean, his he definitely started to lose it a little bit when you got to the mid '80s, but
Yeah, I mean this was Motley Crue in the rawest form,
yeah,
and this is the album that a lot of the critics always go back to. As the album for them. Too Fast for Love. Obviously, they just played that during the stadium tour here.
hmm
Um, yeah, I mean, definitely a solid album. So where does it end up in your rankings here?
I actually have it at number 2 for me.
Okay, number two. All
hmm
right, that's a solid album ranking for sure.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, they
mhm.
definitely changed their sound moving forward. Like after Shout at the Devil, they kind of went a little more toward the glam end than the traditional metal, but and that which is what I prefer. But that's I've always enjoyed this album. So
Yeah, and all right. So yeah, I mean, we're gonna vary a little bit on the different opinions, but that's only because, like you said, there's a couple other albums I just like a little bit better. I mean, but Too Fast for Love is definitely in the upper echelon. For me, it actually falls at number 5, which is pretty much right smack dab in the middle. Um, yeah, so I mean, I don't know. I just like the other albums just a little bit better than this one, and it did kind of surprise me that 2 of the albums that finished ahead of it was actually that they finished ahead of this one. I figured I originally planned this to be out like number 3 for me, and then when I actually went through and actually rated all the albums, it ended up number 5. But that's not a bad thing. All that tells us is that the other albums that are in here, in my opinion, are just a little bit better. That's all. Okay, so there's your first ranking. We decided to change it up a little bit about the way we're doing it. That way, you guys can kind of get a look right away at where the ranking is. You don't have to sit through the whole episode or fast forward and skip the important part that we're talking about. All right, so now we're going to go on down to none other than the second Motley Crue album, which was released on September 26th, 1983, also on the Elektra label, and that's none other than the 4 times platinum Shout at the Devil.
Yeah. Again, definitely a really strong album for the most part. I think the production holds up, but it's not really, with the cover with the pentagram on it is kind of misleading because there's really nothing about the music itself that kind of plays into that whole satanic metal vibe. But I guess that's just kind of the image they were trying to project at the time, because they would never really go back to that devil theme after this. So, but I mean, there's some like 10 Seconds to Love, Too Young to Fall in Love, The Looks That Kill. Those were pretty big off the album, but I think Bastard has always been my favorite song off of it. So,
Yeah, what I wouldn't have done to hear that one live, I would have loved to see them pull that one out of the old hat sometime.
yeah.
And for the most part, they do a pretty good job in the early 2000s to mid 2000s of bringing back some of the old songs they haven't played. Because obviously Tommy was out of the band after a certain point for a couple tours, and they had brought in other drummers. So once they got back together with Tommy, you'd figure that they would definitely try to go back to some of the older songs that they might have skipped around on. Uh, One of Nicky's favorites, obviously, is Red Hot. Man, they used to play that one a lot in like the late '80s and early '90s. That was definitely one of the great songs from this album. And I believe I've heard just about, except for the exception of Bastard and obviously Danger, which don't even get me started on Danger. That's just one of the greatest songs that they've ever written. But because of the fact, I think, what happened after with Vince being arrested for the whole thing with the Hanoi Rocks' drummer who passed away and everything, I think they probably don't touch that because of that, I would assume.
Mhm.
But what's such a great song Danger really is, though. So yeah, so where do you got? Where does Shout at the Devil land in your book here?
I had Shout at the Devil at number 3.
Okay, number 3. Yeah, I figured it would have been high on your list for sure. So basically, this is the album for me that not only was it the first time I ever actually heard of Motley Crue, I consider this their best album. From head to toe on the album. There isn't really much filler on this album whatsoever. I like how In the Beginning goes right into Shout at the Devil. The only thing I could have done without probably was God Bless the Children of the Beast. That was more like a little quick instrumental filler, which goes into pretty much Helter Skelter. But other than that, every other song's totally solid on this album. And it just, I felt they really blew the doors off with this song and this album. This is just a phenomenal album. And in my estimation, it still has yet to be topped by them. So that's my take on Shout, and so that's going to take us over to our next album, which obviously comes with Theater of Pain. Hard to believe Theater of Pain was only the 3rd album. Looking back on it, it feels like they were around a long time up to this point, yet it was only their 3rd album. So Theater of Pain came at us you know, that was June of '85, also on Elektra, which the early part of the catalog was. This album also actually went platinum, and this is where you would say they took their turn towards their glam side. You know, they not only looked at with their look, but their
Yeah.
sound, and a lot of the songs on the album kind of gave you that impression as well. So give me your analogy. What's your ideas on this album? What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really love it that much, but I mean, Home Sweet Home is obviously the biggest song off of it, and it's crazy to think. I mean, other than like that and Smoking in the Boys Room, none of the songs on that album were really. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think about it sold that many records just based on like having two big songs. But I guess Motley Crue was big enough at the time that you could pretty much just sell records on the name alone and the reputation. But yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, a lot of the like the deeper tracks are just kind of forgettable for me. But
yeah, I think it's also forgettable for them too, because
yeah,
the only song they ever really resurrected again after this tour was "Louder Than Hell." They actually played it on the farewell tour, which turned out not to be the farewell tour in 2015.
yeah,
But yeah, they actually played it a lot later on. After I think it was 2005, they might have brought it back, and then it was pretty much used in most of the set lists up until the farewell tour. Obviously, they didn't play it this time around, but yeah, "Louder Than Hell" is probably the next best song out of those. One of the strange things, when the album first came out, you play the you used to it was basically at that time there weren't CDs weren't out yet, so you'd get it on a cassette. So obviously you try to play an album all the way through. So the very first song, "City Boy Blues," one of those songs that, surprisingly enough, it never really got airplay. But to me, I always liked that song, "City Boy Blues." It's probably the next best song on the album behind the ones we just mentioned.
hmm
But like you said, side two kind of is where it's more generic, use it or lose it, save our souls. The only song I can really say that I really like on side two, if you go by the album way, is "Tonight We Need a Lover," which had a good fast riff to it. Um, but other than that, you're right. It's amazing this album has sold that many copies just based really upon the two singles that were released. So you said it was
number six for me.
number six. Okay, so number six for you. And at this point, like, what was the first Crew album for you that where you started once you first start noticing the band and your point, like what album was the one for you that got
What
you into them?
Doctor Feelgood was the album I came in on, so
Okay. Yeah, so
I just
that means this is giving us a perspective from somebody
yeah,
who came in right
yeah,
around the feel good era, which is great because then, obviously my perception, I came in right at Shout at the Devil, like I mentioned. So we're
hmm
getting two good views here, and it gives us a good overall picture of the band here, taking it from two different perspectives, which is great. It'll be interesting to see where this other, the later catalog goes um, for them. But for me, believe it or not, this is number two for me. I was kind of surprised. I definitely did not expect this album to rank that high, especially after you just heard my what I said about it, side two being kind of generic with some of those
hmm
songs. I was kind of surprised, but for some reason, it's might sound generic some of those songs, but to me they're consistently generic, which was good enough to maintain. It's not like you're gonna skip the tracks on it like you might on another album that we'll talk about down the road. It's just not anything that's really real memorable, like "Smoking in the Boys Room" or "Home Sweet Home." But I think it's good rock. It's just it could have been a lot better. That's all. And
yeah.
that's why I'm still surprised it's number two for me. But that's how it finished up in my ranking system. So that's home. That's for the Theater of Pain. And then next album we're going to talk about is "Girls, Girls, Girls." And this would have been the first time I have ever gotten to see them live. So they came out in May of 1987. Went just like the other two albums before it, Shout and Theater. It also went four times platinum.
hmm
So this album definitely was a good rebounding album as far as airplay was concerned, because they did get a lot of airplay with this album. But once again, it just didn't seem to me like had to have the full power of Shout at the Devil, although it had glimpses. But so this one actually reached number 2 on the charts. So it definitely brought them back compared to where they, got them a little bit better than Theater of Pain. I felt they were back to the more Motley Crue look,
Hmm.
because they weren't dressed up in their glam outfits like they were on Theater of Pain. They were more, heavier with the leather and stuff. Um, but yeah, overall, girls, 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 definitely kept them up there in the limelight and in the forefront there of the metal scene. What was your take on them?
Yeah, I mean, I think I like it more than Theater of Pain. I mean, Wild Side is one of their classic live tracks to play. It always kills every time.
Hmm.
And I think it's the best song on the album. I mean, Dancing on Glass is pretty good, and Bad Boy Boogie. But I mean, if you've ever read like the Nikki Sixx's book, The Heroin Diaries, which is basically the diary he kept while they were on that tour in '87, and just how much of a mess he was at that time. So I think the music and just the whole band dynamic got a little sloppy around that era. So, and I mean, a lot of the deeper tracks on here aren't very memorable either. So
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right on this one. There's a couple tracks on here that I would definitely probably skip myself if I'm listening to it. And this is like the first real Motley Crue album where I would definitely skip a few of the tracks. Um, Up to this point, I would probably play all the other ones all the way through, but for some reason, this one um, did not really have the full arsenal that you're used to for Motley Crue. Although the songs that did get the airplay definitely, were powerful enough to really help push this album to sell 4 million copies.
mhm. Yeah,
What do you got for where did you say this one ended up for you?
I had this one at number 5.
Number 5. Okay. All right. So we were close on this one. So we both kind of agree. I'm at number 4. I think for the most part, obviously the first track, Girls, 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 was the first single where you heard it on the radio when it first came out, and then later on Wild Side followed. Uh, those two songs alone definitely helped put this album on the map. Later on, I think they made a video for "You're All I Need," the ballad on the album, which to me is one of their better ballads. I really like "You're All I Need" for sure. They actually kicked off the "Girls, Girls, Girls" tour with "All in the Name of." That was another song that they played on this album live, and I believe "Dancing on Glass" was also played live.
Hmm.
But there's, we could do without Nona. We can do without 5 Years Dead, Something for Nothing. And do we really need the Jailhouse Rock cover? I don't know.
Yeah,
This,
well, a lot of their covers aren't the greatest, but
yeah, this album, this is when I saw this tour, it's the first time I ever got to see him, and Whitesnake opened. And I don't know if you ever got a chance to read the review in the Buffalo News, and it's still hits home where they and if anybody that was there, if you saw both the full show, there's nobody there that could ever really say that Motley Crue was the better band that night, because they weren't.
no,
Whitesnake blew them right off the stage. There
yeah.
was no comparison. Even the newspaper had the headline right when it said that on the headline. It
Hmm.
was just, I think what Motley Crue did is they kind of shot themselves in the foot, because they did like near the end of the show, they did like a medley of cover songs, and at that point, who we didn't really need to hear that. We don't care who you like and all that kind of stuff. They obviously they put Jailhouse Rock in there, and then they did some other covers. But I think that's where the show lost it. So they didn't really play like a full, most bands at the time were doing anywhere from 15 to 18 songs. And if you count the cover songs as like one song, because it was only a short, it wasn't like an extended set.
Hmm.
It was only like one song, so you weren't really getting like extra songs out of the deal. And it just, I don't know, the show just didn't go over as good as for the first time seeing them as I would have hoped. And of course, having Whitesnake open probably wasn't a good thing because at the time they
Well,
were
yeah,
just
that '87 Whitesnake album is a classic. So
yeah, that was just something else that whole tour there. So but for me, girls clocks in at number 4. So that's where we are with that one. And then we come up to the era where you walk in here. So we're going to go to the Dr. Feelgood, comes out September of 1989. And to date, this is their biggest selling studio album, 6 times platinum.
mhm.
Tons of airplay, tons of videos on MTV all over the place. Uh, give me your thoughts on this album.
Yeah, I mean, this is their sober album where they were you could tell that they were really trying hard to make it the best product they could be. And I mean, I think from top to bottom, Motley Crue's writing and I mean Nikki Sixx's melodies on this album are top notch. I mean, the production is definitely more slick and polished than their earlier stuff. I mean, some of the guitar tones aren't the greatest; they're not very menacing, but just in terms of like radio hits, I mean, you could turn on any radio station here, I don't know, like a daily basis and hear something from this album. So, and it's and plus the vibe is just it's a fun listen. So I always enjoy it anytime I put it on. So
Did you get to see this tour at all?
no,
No? Okay.
no, I didn't see them until they played it on they played it in its entirety on the Crew Fest 2 show at Darien Lake, which I was at, which was it was cool to hear those songs, like a lot of the stuff that they hadn't played in a while. But Vince's voice at that point wasn't as good as it had been. So I mean, he was definitely getting some benefit by the backup singers. So, but to see them play like stuff like Rattlesnake Shake and She Goes Down was pretty cool. So
Yeah. That's one song I never got to see. One thing I want to mention too that I almost forgot. This was their first and only to date #1 album. Next album actually topped the charts. So 6 million copies will do the trick. And just to give you a heads up there, Bob Rock was the producer for this album. Obviously, he's known for producing Metallica among others. So he this album definitely solid album, had great production, and it had a great cast of extra people on it too. If you ever got a chance to look at the track listings of all the guest stars that appeared on this album, I mean, you got Bryan Adams playing some background vocals, Steven Tyler from Aerosmith, um, Jack Blades did some background vocals from Night Ranger, Robin Zander. So they had a good mix of special guests on this album, and definitely this album was the album that really helped push them over the top. And unfortunately, pretty much later on down the road after this tour was to end, it signaled the end of Vince Neil being in the band for a short period of time. But it's a shame because I would have liked to have seen what they would have done. I feel Motley Crue, in my opinion, was one of the bands that kind of hurt this genre of music because of them firing Vince at the time when they did, when they should have been making another album. It really hurt because you sell 6 million albums and here you go and break up the band. I mean, had this band stayed together, I think they would have been one of the key factors to help. Maybe grunge wouldn't have came in as hard, or this type of music maybe wouldn't have gotten taken much of a hit like it did. But once Motley Crue ended up breaking up for those, they never made another album again until John Corabi came in and took over. So there was a lot of, they weren't out there helping keeping the flame alive for this type of music, unfortunately. And I feel that definitely hurt this whole era in a whole. So I partly blame it on that, because it's as quickly as a death that this type of music ended up dying. A lot of it had to do with some of the bands that were still big at the time not being able to keep it going. And this band, the only reason why they didn't keep it going is because they were fighting and they got rid of Vince, and then they had to wait to get a new singer. And by the time they actually came out with another album, then they kind of went to the way of that grungy sound a little bit there too, which was kind of unfortunate because this is the type of music that they needed to stick to. But That's just my take on it. So for Feel Good though, you mentioned some of the songs on there. Yeah, I agree with you on She Goes Down. That's one I've always wanted to see live, and I never got the chance to. Unfortunately, I never got to see that Crew Fest 2 tour. But you know, they always play a good amount of songs from this album in concert. Like we just seen them on this stadium tour. They did Feel Good. They did Kickstart My Heart. Same Old Situation, and of course, Don't Go Away Mad. Um, you know, there's some deeper tracks. Without You, they were doing that, I believe, on Carnival of Sins.
Yep.
You know, there's a couple songs on here that they've played at various times during the Feel Good tour. I like Time for Change. That's one of the, unfortunately, yeah, there was a time for change. It was kind of like at the time they didn't know that that was going to come back to come true, that name of that song. But yeah, that's what happened with this band. There was change, and you know, it kind of almost shot themselves in the foot with everything that went down here. But you know, great album. For me, this album clocks in as number 3 for Dr. Feelgood. So definitely a solid album, and definitely in my top 3 Crew albums, clocking in at number 3.
Yeah, I have it at number 4. So
Yep. All right, so we were close. All right, so next, that brings us to none other than the one I mentioned a little while ago, 1994, Motley Crue self-titled, featuring the same band as normal, minus Vince Neil, but we're adding in Mr. John Corabi, who's you know, used to be with the Scream, and this is where he got his big break to join a big time band, and you know, it's unfortunate because this guy, I thought he gave his all, and he did a really good job of, you know, what he can do with the band. He's no Vince Neil, obviously, lyrically or, you know, vocally. He has his own style.
mm-hmm.
And
Completely.
yeah, so this album, even though it was anticipated highly by a lot of the Crew fans, I definitely feel they lost a lot of their audience. Obviously, if you go from 6 million albums down to just a gold album, that tells you something.
Yeah.
And you know, that kind of woke up Nikki, I think, and then they ended up reconciling down the road with Vince. But yeah, so this album reached number 7, which was actually pretty good, you know, considering grunge was in full force by 1994. So to
Mm-hmm.
actually get a gold album out of it was something else too, because you got to remember at that time these hair bands and everything, they were getting the black label against them. They were getting every mark against their name. Everything was grunge, grunge, grunge. Grunge was overselling and taking over big time. So to pull out a top 10 album and on top of it, pulling out a gold album at that point in time was actually, you know, kind of a feat in itself. So that's one thing people don't really look at sometimes. You know, if this music really wasn't that good or whatever, there's no way you're going to sell that many albums. I mean, gold is still respectable,
Mm-hmm.
especially, you know, later on as we go further into the years here. But yeah, so it reached number 7, went gold, and let's get your take on the Lone John Corabi album here.
Yeah, I actually like this album a lot, but it's almost become kind of a contrarian pick at this point because I feel like I've talked to other people and a lot of people probably were Crew fans from the beginning may have not even heard this album. They just didn't want to give it a chance because Vince isn't there. But I mean, I feel like with as big as grunge was at the time, a lot of the bands from that, like the LA Sunset scene or the hair metal scene,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of them, and when Nirvana came out, it was pretty much all those bands were pretty much non-entities commercially, but a lot of them ended up making their heaviest albums in a lot of ways, or completely changing the way that they did things. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
with like Warrant put out Dog Eat Dog, which was completely different than Cherry Pie. I mean, and obviously John Corabi, I think, is a great singer for that style. They kind of wrote the music to suit his voice. And I went back and listened to this album a while, like a couple weeks ago, and there's a lot of good stuff here, but I could see why people wouldn't embrace it at the time because I mean, just the idea of Motley Crue kind of putting an album out in that way, it wasn't really what people wanted to hear. But I think if you look at it as an album and you don't, and like if you put the album on, you like to somebody who's never heard it, and you don't tell them it's Motley Crue, maybe that might change their opinion a little bit.
Yeah, that's definitely a good way of looking at it because, like you said, once you realize it's Motley Crue, you're used to a
Yeah.
certain sound, you're used to a certain voice, and this is totally different from anything that they've ever done, obviously.
I mean, even the Mick's tone on the guitar on this album is very different. So it's a little it's. I mean, Karabi's got a more of an edge, grittiness to his voice, and I mean Tommy's drums are always solid. So I hold this album up pretty high. So
Yeah, where did you say it ended up?
for me, this is my number one. Actually, I was
Oh,
surprised.
wow.
I
All
was
right.
going back and forth between this and Too Fast for Love all week, but I ended up. I think I don't know. I mean, I've met John Corabi before. He's a really cool guy. He's very humble. Like he doesn't. I don't even think like most people know who he is unless you really followed the scene like that because he's never really been in a band that made it huge. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he's a great guy for sure. You know, I think on this album, there's a good handful of songs that you know, definitely stand out on this album. Misunderstood, Love Shine, Drift Away. I think Drift Away is my favorite off this album. Power to the Music was pretty heavy and pretty good opener.
yeah,
Um, you know, I mean, to me, yeah, it was, you know, a lot of the critics, you know, it was a mixed review on a lot of this thing. Like you said, for anybody that was expecting this band to pick up where they left off with Vince, that was not a good assessment, not a fair take, because it's like it was totally different scene out there, a lot of other stuff going on, you know, and you got John also helping with the writing too. You know, back in the Nicky did the majority of the writing on a lot of the other albums. You know, with a you know a few songs here and there, Vince would chime in on or whoever. But this album here, um, it was actually Nicky and John that wrote all the lyrics together, pretty much, and that's who gets all the credit on this album. So, you know, it's kind of weird at that point that Nicky would actually allow John to come in and just help with the lyrics because Nicky always seemed to like to do it all by himself. You know what I mean?
yeah, mm-hmm.
So that was kind of a surprise. But yeah, I mean, you know, for me, you know, I'm looking at it. You know, I would say it's a solid album. It's and I really like Motley Crue. I think that's one of the reasons why this album is gonna probably surprise some, but it's actually gonna fall on the high end for me because I just feel there's better albums by this band. That's all. There's nothing against this album. I mean, it's got some very good tracks on it, but for me, it's clocking in at number 8 for me out of the 9 albums that we're ranking here. So you know that just tells you that you know there's just 7 other ones that are better. In my take, obviously, your take, you're number 1. So we go from one
Yeah,
extreme to the other between me and you here.
yeah. I mean, I even surprised myself, but I and it ended up just being like an album I really got into strongly the last couple of weeks. So that's why it ended up just edging out Too Fast for Love. So
Yeah, I mean, real quick, just to give you a quick heads up, this album, the 2 albums that are ahead of it, it could have been any of the 3. It's just that when I went through the thing, they were like neck and neck and neck, the 3 albums. And unfortunately, the other 2 just had a few little bit, maybe 1 or 2 more songs that I liked off of them better than this one. So, you know, so what can you do? Now, you know, number 8, I'm not slagging the album at all. That's just where it ended up. All right. So that is the lone album from Mr. Karabi here. And that's going to take us back to the reunion with Vince here. June of 1997, the final album on the, well, from Elektra here. And that's going to be Generation Swine, which the return of Vince here in 97, this album actually went to number 4 on the charts. So that's actually pretty good, you know, for this time of the scene here. I mean, I think at this point, grunge was finally starting to not be as dominant as it once was when earlier on. So 97, Swine came out, it went gold, and definitely an interesting album here. What's your take on this one?
I mean, I'm surprised it even went gold because I don't really like it at all. But I mean, I just like even like Vince. I know Vince came back and it was a big deal, but I just don't think he sounds very good on this album. Like I mean, the songs aren't very memorable. The lyrics just seem kind of lazy. But and I don't know how many people in '97 were really clamoring for Motley Crue album, but you know, that's
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. So yeah, so this one, yeah, I mean, this is an album that definitely got to listen to it a few times to kind of catch some of the things on here. It was actually produced by Scott Humphrey, Nikki Sixx, and Tommy Lee. They kind of co-produced it together. Um, Bob Rock was supposed to be, recording the producer, but he was fired at, prior to the music because the band, I guess they were calling him overproducing the music, and he was too expensive. Because like you said, at this point in time, it's not like people were clamoring a Motley Crue album, so they didn't have probably a big enough budget to try to pay Bob Rock, who at this time was doing Metallica, selling millions of albums, and
yeah.
he just commanded a higher price than what he did back when they recorded Feel Good.
Mhm.
So I can understand where Bob Rock is coming from, but Motley Crue felt, okay, well, he's too expensive. We're gonna have to do something else here. So that's what they did. So basically, this album starts off in pretty good fashion, actually. I think the first four songs are solid, in my opinion. Find Myself, good riff. Say out of the first four songs, that's probably the weakest track, but it's still decent. But then you got Afraid, which is cool. And the song that does it for me that I really like, I would say the sleeper on the album is Flush. And interesting enough as it is, John Corabi actually had a hand in Flush. It wasn't called Flush at the time when he had, you know, written it with Tommy and Nikki, but he actually got a writing credit on it because he did. It was called something else at that point, and that song for me is just the best. I feel that's the best song on the album, Flush. I don't know. I just like that one. I thought Vince sounded good on it. Generation Swine, the title track, another one that's I felt kind of underrated in my opinion compared to the slag it got. It never got any airplay or anything, but that one definitely. If you never heard this album, I would definitely recommend that track. And of course, Glitter was the song that kind of brought the old vibe back from the old days. It kind of has like a ballad, but it's a little bit more. It's got a lot of stuff to it, a lot of substance compared to like the regular traditional ballad. They did play this song on Glitter was on the Carnival of Sins as well early on. I don't know if they played it throughout the whole tour, but they did it on the early leg, which is the only time I think I've ever actually seen them do it live. But I believe they did it for this tour as well. But the rest of the album is kind of forgettable. Did you really have to put on "Shout at the Devil" '97 on here?
No,
I don't think they needed to.
it's not. Yeah, that's one of the ones I would have left off.
Yeah, I hate it when a band re-records a track and puts it on a regular album. If you're going to do it for like a greatest hits album or some other type of a live album maybe, and you're going to put on some bonus tracks or something, that's one thing. But to put it on an actual regular release when the song was already as big as it was, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, I know some bands have re-recorded songs, and a good example, we'll do this one here real quick. One good example was Whitesnake, obviously. The original version of Here I Go Again, it's got different lyrics and parts of it, but they re-recorded it and look at it, went all the way up to number one. So there's exceptions to the rule. But in this case, yeah, in this case, we definitely didn't need Shout the Devil '97. So,
no.
All right. So for me, Generation Swine is my number 7. It's clocking in at. So,
I have it at number 8.
So, right. So we're both right near each other here. So we can agree that definitely sounds like we got it ranked in the same general area, exactly where it should be, because obviously there are definitely way better albums than this one for sure. All right, so now moving through the catalog list here, we come out with what they call New Tattoo. And this album marks their 8th album, came out in July of 2000. And out of all the studio albums, with the exception of Too Fast for Love, it ranks as the second worst charting album at number 41. This album did not go gold, did not go platinum, didn't even get a sniff. But it's notable for being the lone album that Tommy Lee does not play drums on for Crue.
Mm-hmm.
So at the time he had left the band, they recorded it with Vinny Castillo. And the tour was actually handled by Samantha Mahoney, who obviously was in Hole. And that's a whole nother story in itself from what all the stories that we hear about what was involved there on that tour. That tour was something else because originally it was supposed to be Motley Crue, Megadeth, and Anthrax. And then Anthrax got kicked off the tour because of whatever. I don't know what they did. I can't remember, but they got kicked off by Motley Crue. So they ended up just finishing the tour out with just Megadeth as the other act on the bill. So
itself.
Yeah, so interesting to say the least. This show didn't even come around. We had to go to Finger Lakes Performing Arts Center, which is now known as CMAC, to even see this tour. I was able to get a ticket like right up front the day of the show, so it wasn't a well-attended show. You know, obviously with no Tommy Lee, that brought a lot of it detracted a lot of people from coming out to see the band because you're going there and you see this girl drummer. You know, I mean, nobody expected a girl to ever drum for Motley Crue, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And you know, I don't think she did a bad job, but yeah, I just didn't sit well with a lot of people, you know, and obviously she never toured with him again, so that was the end of her. You know, so what do you got for New Tattoo?
Yeah, for me, I have it ranked at number 9 as their worst album. I mean, I think Tommy, for all the crap that Motley Crue gets for their debauchery and all the offstage antics, I think Tommy's a great drummer and a great showman. So I think he was kind of a necessary part of the band. That when you lose it, it's definitely noticeable.
Oh, definitely. There's no doubt about that. This album was definitely missing him. You know, that being said, there are a handful of tracks that I really like on this album, you know, given, you know, no Tommy Lee and everything else. But if you were around, that's around the age where the internet really kicked in, and Hell on High Heels was the big song for them on this album. It got some airplay on the local classic rock stations in the area. And it definitely got a lot of mention and talk about online because that's when the online scene started to really kick in. They played a few songs on this. Actually, they played quite a bit off this album in the live show, including the Tubes cover, White Punks on Dope, which actually isn't bad. I think this is one of their better covers over the last few that we talked about. I like it better than Jailhouse Rock, that's for sure. But there's actually 2 songs on this I'm going to mention as the best 2 tracks on this album to give people something to chew on if they're not familiar with this album, go out and get it, or at least listen to New Tattoo, the title track. That's one of the better songs. And then Hollywood Ending is another one. Both on the slower side, ballads type. Hollywood Ending is definitely one of my favorite Motley Crue songs. And it just never really got its just due, you know. The rest of the album, you know, Treat Me Like the Dog I Am. That was a good concert staple song. But it's just, you looking back on it now, you look and go, a lot of this stuff is very forgettable for the most part. And, you know, it just didn't really connect with the fans, unfortunately. You know, are there any songs on here that stuck out to you at all, even though you said you weren't too favorable on this one at all?
Yeah, I think Punched in the Teeth by Love, I kind of like.
Yeah, that's one of the more powerful ones that Nicky always talks about that one. He used to like that one. You know, this was one of those albums where they released a lot of bonus tracks that were only on different versions of the album, not the regular release.
Yeah.
And there's a couple good ones that didn't make the cut that I always liked. There was one called American Zero that was pretty cool. Sometimes these bands make these songs and then they don't put them on the album. And you go, why isn't the song on the album? And then you hear some of the songs that did make the album. You go, what were they thinking?
Yeah, it's
So
like Primal Scream from '91 is a pretty good song too that never made it on an album. It was on that Decade of Decadence collection.
yes, definitely. That's definitely a good standout track that you just mentioned. That's one of Nicky's favorite. And if you realize they play that almost every single show. There's not a cruise show that I've seen since that song came out that they haven't played it at. It's just one of those cool riffs, got that good bass going. And yeah, he really loves that song. I know that's got to be probably one of his favorite songs ever that he's ever written for sure.
Mhm.
All right, so yeah, so that's so I think the only thing I got to mention is where it lands for me. You said yours was number 9, and so for me it actually ended up at number 6. So it beats out Generation Swine by a nose, and then really the gap between 5 and 6 for me, which was Too Fast for Love, if you remember from the first album we talked about, to New Tattoo, even though they're right next to each other, the gap is a lot bigger. You know what I mean, from one album to the next. So that's kind of where I draw the line for Motley Crue. Everything from Too Fast for Love uh, down, and then New Tattoo up is pretty much where my separation line falls for Crue on the most part. All right, so we got one album left to talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're moving along here. So this is working out pretty good. So we got none other than their most recent release, which came out in 2008. Wow, it's hard to believe. That's been
Mhm.
14 years ago, June 24th, 2008. Wow, where's the time go?
Mhm.
Saints of Los Angeles came out surprisingly. No one really knew that they were going to make this album, and then all of a sudden they hit it with us. Came out, landed on number 4 on the charts, so not too shabby. Considering their last album, New Tattoo, came out in number 41. So, like you said, having Tommy Lee back in 8 years later, look at where it lands on the charts. So, goes to show you that people like original lineups, and they're willing to pay for it.
Mhm.
So, what do you got for me on Saints of Los Angeles? Give me your.
Yeah, I remember they put this album out in '08. It pretty much coincided with the announcement that they were doing the first Crew Fest. So they put the album out and they started that tour at the same time. So like them in which the title track I remember hearing on the radio a lot, and which I think they still play it live now. So
Yeah, they did it at the stadium tour.
so I mean it's a fun album. I mean it's kind of a throwback to the '80s sound a little bit. So it's definitely it's got kind of that party vibe, which they're always known for. So I like it. Of the 2000s releases, it was my favorite. So
Yeah, the interesting thing with this album is that every single track was written with mostly Mick Mars, James Michael, who of course is Nicky's partner.
6 a.m. Yeah,
Yep, and DJ Ashba too. They
yeah,
wrote the majority of the album together. So these are songs that had a lot of collaboration on, and then none other than Mr. Marty Aerosmith Fredrickson, who did a lot of work with Aerosmith. He actually helped write every single one of these songs as well. So you have you know, and overall to me, this album, Saints of Los Angeles, obviously, like we said, they play that pretty much every show. They played it on the farewell tour. Animal and Me is one of the deep tracks that I really enjoy on this one. Um, Another one I like is White Trash Circus. It's got a cool riff to it, and Going Out Swinging. Those are the two other songs that I would recommend on here. And some of the other ones, Down at the Whiskey's not bad. That's pretty good. Anything stand out for you on this album?
I mean I remember listening to it a lot at the time, but I have probably haven't listened to it in probably 5 or 6 years. But it's I mean like it was cool that they came back and they had some new stuff to play when they were into to inject into the live sets, but I don't think like even now 14 years have passed. I don't think a lot of people really remember like look back on this album and like remember it fondly anymore. It was kind of like it came out and it's kind of forgotten about now. So
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And I
yeah,
think that's one of the reasons why they probably play Saints of Los Angeles because, obviously, I think on the stadium tour,
hmm
I think it would have been better if they would have done a couple more older tracks
yeah,
and I could have done without Saints of Los Angeles. I mean, what are you trying to do? Push a few more extra copies? It's kind of like what Metallica did when they came the next day after the stadium tour. Here you got James trying to force Saint Anger down our throats, which was
yeah.
something in itself. He's trying to push it off, saying, "Oh, that wasn't that bad of an album, was it?" And everybody started booing him. So he actually took it on the chin in Buffalo, at least when he's tried to push Saint Anger on us. So kind of
Yeah.
glad because I was actually one of the ones booing, so I didn't care. But yeah. So I mean, why are you trying to push an album that why? There's so many other songs that you haven't been playing in a long time. Why didn't you push Red Hot? Why didn't you push this? Why didn't you push? There's so many other songs that you got to remember. A lot of these people have never seen the Crew before, so why don't you show them what the Crew is really all about? We don't really care about Saints of Los Angeles. It would have been better to see some of the older, even something older from the first or second album to really, hey, this is what Motley Crue is about, man. Let us show you. Because you got to remember, there are a lot of people on the stadium tour that never seen any of these bands before. So for
hmm
them, it was and the Motley Crue, I think they could have really used. They should have tried to pull out all the stops because, like we said off camera before, we were talking about this. They took the worst beating in the press out of all the bands on the bill.
hmm
Everybody's saying Joan Jett was phenomenal, and this new band, Classless Act, was pretty good, considering nobody really knew any of their music. And then all you ever heard about was how bad Motley sounded, how bad Vince sounded. I don't think it was really a matter too much of that because they always had
hmm
uh, that sound in concert. That Vince is always, you look at the last 20 years of Motley Crue, Vince hasn't sounded like it was 1987, in a long time. So who cares? But you make up for it by doing other things that I think would have helped them and maybe would have gotten the press off their back a little bit. But that's just me. So,
hmm
but so that's where we stand. So where do you got Saints lining up on your
Yeah,
list?
I had it at number 7.
Okay, all right. So for me, actually, this was actually number 9. So we got the John Corabi album, self-titled, beating out Saints of Los Angeles. So, um, I feel that's exactly where it belongs. Unfortunately, it's just not as solid as any of the other Crew releases. So that's where we stand with this one here. So I don't know. Will we ever see another Motley Crue album? I don't know. You never say never in this business because every time you think somebody's done,
Yeah.
they pull something out of the hat, and there you are.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't think they were supposed to tour again either. So
Exactly. Yeah. So you just never know for sure. So that's our take on Motley Crue. Give us your take and your albums listed in the comments here. Did you have anything else to add from Motley at all?
no, I think we covered it pretty well.
All right. Yeah. So that's our take on Crue. Overall, a solid catalog, which we both feel that has its ups and downs, but for the most part, I feel definitely it's one of the more solid catalogs out there compared to some bands really release some dogs. I mean, Motley Crue, even though Saints of Los Angeles for me ended up number 9, I wouldn't call it a dog. So
Mm.
I would say they haven't made a real bad album ever. In my opinion, all the albums at least have something good on them. There's other bands out there that I'm sure once we get into them, ranking them, you're gonna hear our takes on them, and you're gonna see exactly what we're talking about. But for the most part, Motley Crue definitely a solid album catalog from a band who's been going at it for a very, very long time, over 40 years now. And that closes the book on Motley Crue for this episode. And I think, probably we'll be doing a ranking the songs of Motley Crue. We'll probably do like a top 10 or 15 somewhere down the road here. So stay tuned for that. We'll let you know once that's up and running and everything. And other than that,